Imagine that you are holding in your hands a book that has been banned. Not banned by some dictator, not censored by a fleeting regime, but banned by Western thought for centuries, burned in public squares, ripped from shelves, cursed from pulpits from Rome to Amsterdam, from Lisbon to Warsaw. Imagine that in this book there is a single question, a simple, almost innocent question, posed by a man with a soft voice who lived in a small room, who made a living polishing lenses for telescopes, who died poor, expelled from his community, rejected by the world around him, and yet wrote words that no religious institution on the planet has been able to destroy. The question was this: what if Genesis is not what you think it is? The name of this man was Baruch Spinoza, and what he discovered, or perhaps it is more accurate to say, what he dared to see with his own eyes without asking permission from any authority, changed forever the relationship between human reason and the sacred text. You are about to embark on a journey that begins in the 17th century, in the cobblestone streets of the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, where the smell of spices and the murmur of prayers in Hebrew mingled with the aroma of the sea and the perfume of freedom that city promised and rarely fulfilled. A journey that passes through the secret corridors of the Inquisition, through the philosophical debates that shook the thrones of Europe, through handwritten manuscripts in tiny letters on the cold nights of the Dutch winter, with ink that dried slowly like blood. This journey ends here today with you, because Spinoza's question about Genesis is not a question of the past. It is the most urgent question that humanity has yet to have the courage to answer completely. It is the question that divides theologians and scientists, believers and atheists, conservatives and progressives, not because it is aggressive, but because it is relentlessly honest. What does the text of Genesis really say when you read it, without the glasses of doctrine, without the filter of fear, without the voice of the priest saying, "This is not for you to interpret"? Spinoza read, Spinoza saw, and what he saw will change the way you understand not only the Bible, but God, nature, time, creation, and yourself. Get ready. This story begins now. Amsterdam 1640. The freest city in Europe, they said. And perhaps it really was, at least compared to what existed beyond its borders. But freedom, in that century, was a word that needed to be used with caution because it always had an asterisk next to it. There was freedom for those who had money. There was freedom for those who belonged to the right church. There was freedom for those who did not ask too many questions. Bento de Espinosa was 8 years old and already asked too many questions. He was born in 1632, the son of Michael de Espinosa, a moderately successful merchant who was part of the Sephardic community of Amsterdam, the Jews expelled from the Iberian Peninsula who found relative refuge in Holland. The family spoke Portuguese at home, because Portugal was still a living memory. The stories of the grandparents always came laden with escapes, disguises, changed names, hidden Torahs beneath loose floorboards. The Espinosa family knew what it was to survive while keeping faith a secret. But young Bento did not inherit the talent for secrecy. Instead, he inherited the talent for seeing. The school he attended, Etzheim, was considered one of the best Jewish schools in Europe. There they taught Hebrew, Aramaic, the scriptures, rabbinic commentaries, the oral and written Torah, the Talmud, Kabbalah. They taught how to read the sacred text, and more importantly, how not to read it. There was a correct way to interpret, There were invisible but rigorously policed boundaries that separated permitted commentary from dangerous commentary. Young Bento always arrived first in class. He always left last. One of the teachers, Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera, had a special affection for the boy. He saw in him a rare, almost frightening intelligence. He told others that Bento memorized entire passages of scripture after a single reading, that he made connections between texts that even the rabbis took years to notice. Mortera imagined he was cultivating the greatest scholar the Sephardic community had ever produced. He did not know he was cultivating the one whom the Sephardic community would most fear in history. It was around the age of 10 that young Bento first asked the question that would change everything. The class was studying the first chapter of Genesis, Bereshit, in Hebrew, in the beginning. The narrative that everyone knows, or thinks they know, On the first day God created light. On the second he separated the waters. On the third he created dry land and plants. On the fourth the sun, the moon and the stars. On the fifth the sea creatures and the birds. On the sixth the land animals and finally human beings. On the seventh he rested. Bento listened attentively. He listened to the rabbi's explanation of how each day represented a different dimension of divine creation, about the symbolism of the number 7, about the perfect structure of the cosmos emerging from the hands of God. And then he raised his hand. "Rabbi," he said, with that still boyish voice, but with a precision that made the adults uncomfortable, "if God created the sun on the fourth day, how can there be light on the first day? What was that light before there was a source of light?" The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds weighed tons. Rabbi Mortera smiled, as masters do when a question is too good to be answered simply. He said there were Kabbalistic explanations, that the primordial light was different from the light of the sun, that it was a spiritual light, the light of God before the materiality of the cosmos. Bento nodded. He seemed satisfied, but at night in his room, with a thin candle illuminating the Hebrew text before his eyes, he was not satisfied. He was asking more questions, and the more the text answered, the more questions arose. Why are there 2 creation stories in Genesis? Chapter 1 describes the creation in one way. Chapter 2 begins the narrative again, differently, with the creation of man happening before the plants, with contradictory details, with completely distinct language. 2 authors, 2 different traditions stitched together. And if so, who stitched them, and why? Why does the text say that God regretted having created humankind before the flood? Can God, who is omniscient, regret anything? An infinite being who knows everything from the beginning can be caught off guard by the behavior of its creatures? The Hebrew word used, vinahem, means exactly regret, a change of feeling. How to reconcile this with the idea of a perfect and unchanging God? Why do the first verses of Genesis use the word Elohim to refer to God, a word that is in the plural? Doesn't Elohim mean gods? And if a single God created the universe, why does the text say, "Let us make humankind in our image," in the plural voice, as if there were multiple creators deliberating together? Bento was 12 years old when he began to record these questions in a small notebook that he kept hidden between the floorboards of his room, in the same tradition of concealment that his ancestors used to hide the Torah from the Inquisition. But what he was hiding was different. It was not faith, it was doubt. He continued studying. He learned Latin on his own, then Greek, then enough Arabic to read medieval Islamic philosophers, Averroes, Avicenna, Al-Farabi. He read Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish philosopher who had already tried to reconcile Aristotelian reason with biblical faith. He read Christian commentators who for centuries debated the same text of Genesis, trying to resolve the same contradictions. And the more he read, the more a conclusion began to take shape in his mind, a conclusion still vague, still frightening, but as inevitable as the tide. The contradictions in Genesis were not mistakes. They were not imperfections that faith should ignore. They were clues. They were signs. They were the visible mark of a complex historical human process that had produced the text that the world called the Word of God. This conclusion did not make the text any less sacred to him. It made it more fascinating, richer, more real. It made it human, and what is more human than an attempt to reach the infinite with finite words? But for the community around him, this conclusion was not an enrichment. It was a bomb, and bombs in that century were not welcome even in the freest cities of Europe. Young Bento continued polishing lenses during the day. He learned his father's trade, which he took over when his father died when Bento was 22, leaving debts and a fragile business. And he continued, on the nights of Dutch winter, polishing something else more difficult and more dangerous, his worldview. A worldview that would soon collide with everything around it. The collision was coming, and when it arrived, it would not be silent. In Amsterdam in the 1650s, there was a group of men who gathered in discreet rooms to talk about the unthinkable. They were not criminals. They were mostly merchants, doctors, amateur philosophers, some disenchanted religious figures. They spoke in low voices not out of fear of being overheard, but because the ideas they exchanged seemed so dense, so loaded, that they needed space, and loud voices seemed inappropriate for them. Baruch Spinoza was the youngest of this group. He was just over 20 when he began attending these study circles that organized around the new philosophies coming from France. Descartes, mainly, whose discourse on method had shaken the continent like an intellectual earthquake. Spinoza read Descartes with the same intensity he read the Bible, and found in the Frenchman something he recognized, the refusal to accept anything without the proof of reason. But Spinoza went beyond Descartes, far beyond, because while Descartes still carefully kept God and nature separate, the creator and the creation, Spinoza began to ask a question that Descartes himself would probably have found too daring to voice aloud. What if God and nature are not two separate things? What if God is nature and nature is God? This idea, which would become known as pantheism, although Spinoza never used that word, was simultaneously the simplest and most devastating idea that Western philosophy had confronted since Plato. And it changed everything. It changed everything about Genesis. Because if God is not a being separate from the cosmos, if God is not outside the universe looking in, if God is not a transcendent will that intervenes in human affairs from time to time, then Genesis cannot be the story of a divine craftsman shaping the clay of the cosmos with his own hands. It cannot be a historical account of events that happened in 6 literal days. It cannot be the transcription of a supernatural revelation made to Moses on Mount Sinai. It has to be something else. But what? Spinoza's answer, developed over years, in letters, in treatises, in late-night conversations with that small circle of intellectual friends, was at once more humble and more radical than anything that religious tradition had produced. Genesis is a human document, written by humans, edited by humans, for humans, at a specific historical moment, with specific historical, political, moral objectives, and its truth, and he insisted there was a deep truth in it, does not reside in the facts it describes, but in the questions it raises, not in the cosmology it proposes, but in the ethics it constructs, not in the account of how the world was made, but in the meditation on why we exist and how we should live. This distinction between the text as literal history and the text as philosophical moral document seems obvious today. There are modern theologians, cardinals, rabbis, pastors who would agree with it without hesitation. But in the 17th century, in Amsterdam in 1656, this distinction was a crime that the Sephardic Jewish community of Amsterdam treated with the utmost severity available to it. On July 27, 1656, Baruch Spinoza was subjected to cherem, the most severe excommunication in Judaism. The official document, read publicly in the synagogue, is extraordinary in its intensity. Using Hebrew formulas that evoke all the curses of the Old Testament, it declares Spinoza excluded, expelled, cursed, and detested. It prohibits any member of the community from speaking to him, writing to him, being in the same room as him, reading anything he had written, or doing any favor for him. The curious and disturbing aspect of this document is what it does not say. It does not specify what Spinoza's transgression was. It does not cite any text, any statement, any specific heresy. It simply condemns him using the most violent language available, without saying why. Historians have debated for centuries what really caused the cherem. There were accusations that Spinoza had said that the Torah was not written by Moses. There were rumors that he denied the immortality of the soul. There were reports that he had claimed that the God of the Bible was a human construction, not a real and independent being. All these things were true, but there was something even more fundamental beneath all of this. Spinoza had read Genesis with his own eyes, not with the eyes of the rabbi, not with the eyes of tradition. With his own eyes, his own reason, his own rigorous method of asking what the text really says, not what they say it says. And what he saw when he read this way was something the community could not bear, not because it was wrong, but because it was too true. At 23, Spinoza was expelled from the only community he had. His friends abandoned him. His family distanced themselves. The trade he maintained with the Sephardic community disappeared overnight. He moved to a modest boarding house. He took with him his books, his notebook, and the lenses he polished. And he began to write. But before we move on to this writing that would shake Europe, there is something I need to ask you. You have come this far in the story because something in it touched you. Perhaps it is Spinoza's courage. Perhaps it is the feeling that you too have asked questions you were not supposed to ask. Perhaps it is simply the curiosity to know where this will lead. What do you think Spinoza found within Genesis that was so explosive, so unbearable, that an entire community preferred to lose one of its greatest geniuses rather than endure him continuing to speak? Leave your answer in the comments now, because what comes next is exactly what tradition tried to silence, and that you, having come this far, have already shown enough courage to hear. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, do so now. Not because I am asking, but because the next parts of this story are the densest, the most disturbing, and you will want to be here when they arrive. The excommunication did not silence Spinoza. It did the opposite. It freed him. There is a biographical detail about Spinoza that history books usually mention in passing, as if it were irrelevant, but I think it is fundamental to understanding everything he produced afterward. He polished lenses, not as a hobby, as a profession, as the concrete material way with his own hands, that he used to earn a living during the most productive years of his philosophical existence. Spinoza rented rooms in the homes of Dutch families sympathetic to his cause, in Rijnsburg, then in Voorburg, and finally in The Hague, and spent his mornings bent over the workbench with polishing tools, shaping glass surfaces into mathematically precise curves. A philosopher who spends hours a day making perfect curves in glass knows something that library philosophers usually do not know: that reality has a texture, a resistance, an internal logic that does not bend to human will. You cannot ask glass to be different. You discover what glass is and work with it. The lens does not lie. It was this stance, the stance of the craftsman who respects the material he works with, that Spinoza brought to his reading of Genesis. 3 years after the Cherem, in 1659, Spinoza had completed a first version of a text that circulated in manuscript among his close friends. It was not yet the theological political treatise that would come more than a decade later. It was something more intimate, even more explosive. A set of letters and notes in which he began to dismantle, screw by screw, the narrative mechanism of the first book of the Bible. The text began with a methodological question that sounded simple, but had terrible implications. What is the correct method for interpreting Scripture? The answer that religious authorities, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, all of them, would give was unanimous. The correct method is what tradition teaches. You interpret Scripture based on previous interpretations. You respect what the wise have said. You trust in the continuity of transmission. Spinoza's answer was different, radically different. The correct method for interpreting Scripture, he said, is the same method we use to interpret any other ancient text. Study the original Hebrew and Greek in their historical complexity. Establish who wrote it, when, for whom, in what political and social context. Identify the layers of editing, recognize the internal contradictions, and treat them as information, not as embarrassments. And above all, do not project onto the text what you want him to say. Let the text speak. This method, which would become known centuries later as historical literary criticism, seems reasonable today. It is the method that modern Bible scholars, including many religious theologians, use without problems. But in the 17th century it was subversive on the scale of an earthquake, because if you apply this method to Genesis, what happens? The first thing that happens is that you realize that the original Hebrew text is much more complex, much more ambiguous, much more stratified than the translations suggest. The word Bereshit, usually translated as in the beginning, is technically a genitive form that can be read as in the beginning of, leading to a sentence that would be more precisely translated as when God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless and empty, implying that matter already existed before the creative act, not creation out of nothing, but ordering of what already existed. This is a huge theological difference. Creation ex nihilo. The idea that God created the universe from absolute nothingness, from a pure and sovereign will, is one of the pillars of medieval Christian and Jewish theology. But this idea is not clearly and unequivocally in the Hebrew text of Genesis. It is an interpretation, a choice of translation, a theological decision made centuries after the composition of the original text. Spinoza realized this, and he realized he was not alone in noticing. There were medieval rabbis, Christian commentators, who had noticed the same ambiguity. But they had chosen to ignore it or to circumvent it with elaborate arguments because the alternative, to admit that the text did not say what doctrine needed it to say, was unbearable. The second thing Spinoza realizes, when applying his method, is the issue of the two creation narratives, which he analyzes with almost scientific meticulousness. Chapter 1 of Genesis is written in a solemn, repetitive, liturgical style. Each day begins with, "And God said," and ends with, "And there was evening and morning, the day N." The name of God used is consistently Elohim. Humankind is created on the sixth day, man and woman simultaneously, as the culmination of a progressive creation. Chapter 2 changes everything. The style becomes narrative, almost novelistic, with concrete and emotional details. The name of God changes. Now it is Yo Elohim, the Lord God. Creation is described in a different order. First the man, then the plants, then the animals, and finally the woman, created from a rib of the man, not simultaneously. The God of chapter 2 walks in the garden. He asks questions. He needs to call Adam to know where he is. For any reader who pays attention, this is inexplicable, except for one reason. Two different texts by different authors from different times have been fused into one. Modern scholars call these two authors the Yahwist, the author who uses YHWH, and the Elohist, the one who uses Elohim. Spinoza did not have these names, but he had the eyes, and what his eyes saw, he was not willing to describe in any way other than honestly. One night, it must have been winter, because the Dutch cold was seeping through the cracks of the windows of the house in Rijnsburg, Spinoza stopped writing for a moment and stared at the flame of the candle before him. The candlelight was not the light of the room. It was the light of the first day of Genesis, the light that exists before the sun, before any physical source of light. It was the primordial light, the Or Haganuz of Jewish mystics, the light that God reserved for the righteous at the end of times. But Spinoza that night was thinking of something else. He was thinking that the creation story in Genesis is not a story about how the universe physically came into being. It is a story about how human beings order chaos, how they impose form upon formlessness, how they separate day from night, the waters above from the waters below, the land from the sea, because that is exactly what the human mind does all the time when perceiving reality. Genesis is not cosmology, it is psychology, it is epistemology. It is the story of how human consciousness, or if you prefer, the divine consciousness that expresses itself through the human, organizes the world, making it intelligible. This idea, which Spinoza was just beginning to formulate that night, would be developed over the following years into one of the most extraordinary philosophical works humanity has ever produced. But before that book was written, there was another obstacle to overcome, an obstacle that was not in the texts or the ideas, but in the faces of men with enough temporal power to destroy not only books, but the man who wrote them. The Inquisition, although it had no formal jurisdiction in Protestant Holland, had long arms, and there were other powers, the Dutch Reformed Church, the very government of Amsterdam, that watched with growing discomfort at what the excommunicated philosopher was doing at his small polishing bench. The danger was real, and Spinoza knew it. What is fascinating, what borders on the incomprehensible, is that he kept writing nonetheless. To understand what Spinoza will do with Genesis, what his reading transforms into the most radical text of Western philosophy, one must first understand the central idea that underpins all his thought, the idea that made him hated by the religious and admired by philosophers. The idea that, depending on your point of view, is either the most atheistic or the most religious that any thinker has ever formulated. The idea is this: God and nature are the same thing. In Latin, Spinoza formulated it this way: Deus sive natura, God or nature. The conjunction or here does not indicate an alternative. It is not God or nature, choose one. It is equivalence. God is nature. Nature is God. There are not two substances. There is one infinite substance, of which everything that exists is an expression, a mode, a manifestation. This seems simple, but it has consequences that branch out in all directions until radically transforming the entire edifice of Western religious and philosophical thought. Consequence number 1. If God and nature are the same thing, then God is not a personal being. He does not have a will separate from the laws of nature. He does not make decisions. He cannot be prayed to. He does not get angry, does not rejoice, does not repent. The God of the Bible who repents of having made man, that God cannot exist within Spinoza's system. Not because Spinoza is an atheist, but because Spinoza has a conception of God that is infinitely greater than that of a powerful king with human emotions. Consequence number 2. If God is the totality of nature, then everything that exists participates in the divine. Every stone, every animal, every human thought, every star, all of this is a mode of expression of the one infinite substance. The human being is not a creature made of clay to whom God breathed life from the outside. The human being is a part of God himself, thinking about himself. Consequence number 3. And here we come directly to Genesis. If God does not create the universe from the outside, like an architect who designs and builds a house in which he will live later, then the narrative of Genesis cannot be a literal description of events. It has to be an allegory, a metaphor, a myth in the noble sense of the word, a story that carries a deep truth about the human condition without pretending to be a scientific or historical report. And here is where Spinoza becomes revolutionary, in a way that has not yet been fully assimilated. He is not saying that Genesis is false. He is saying that Genesis is true in a way different from what has been taught. The narrative of the 6 days of creation, for Spinoza, is the narrative of how the human mind categorizes the experience of reality. The primordial chaos, the earth was formless and empty, is reality before the imposition of cognitive categories. Each day of creation represents a fundamental distinction that consciousness makes. Between light and darkness, distinction between presence and absence, between being and non-being, between the waters above and the waters below, distinction between the transcendent and the immanent, between the spiritual and the material, between the land and the sea, distinction between the permanent and the fluid, between form and matter. The human being, created on the 6th day in the image of God, is not a creature made of clay that received a supernatural breath of life. He is the ultimate expression of nature's self-awareness, the point at which the one infinite substance becomes capable of thinking about itself. The human being is not created by God. The human being is God becoming conscious. This idea was not only revolutionary for the 17th century, it was potentially the most liberating and most terrifying thought in the intellectual history of the West. Liberating because it forever dissolved the distance between the sacred and the profane. If everything is God, then nothing is profane. Every moment of existence, every beautiful sunset, every honest conversation, every act of love, every scientific discovery is a manifestation of the divine. You do not need to go to the synagogue, the cathedral, or the mosque to find God. You just need to open your eyes. Terrifying because at the same time it dissolved the foundation of the power of religious institutions. If God does not communicate through revealed texts, if there are no specially chosen prophets, if there is no church that holds the key to access the divine, then what is the function of the priest, the rabbi, the pope? If God is the entire nature, what use is an organized religion? For Spinoza, the answer was that religion served, and should serve, ethics. The function of any sacred text, including Genesis, was not to convey cosmological or historical knowledge. It was to cultivate virtue, to teach love for one's neighbor, to build just communities, to help human beings live well together. Everything else in the sacred text, the creation narratives, the miracles, the prophetic revelations, was poetic language, adapted to the level of understanding of the people for whom it was written at the time it was written. It was not literal truth, it was symbolic truth. And confusing the two forms of truth, the fundamental error that both religious authorities and militant atheists commit, each in their own way, was for Spinoza the source of immeasurable suffering. In his rented room, with the lenses before him and the manuscripts spread across the bed, Spinoza developed this idea over the years. He debated it in letters with philosophers from all over Europe. There was a network of intellectual correspondence that functioned as the predecessor of scientific academies, with letters traveling weeks from Paris to The Hague, from London to Amsterdam, exchanging ideas with a precision and passion that modern emails rarely achieve. And in each letter, in each debate, the same question kept coming back. If God is nature, if the Bible is a human document, if Genesis is allegory, what prevents us from falling into moral chaos? If there is no personal God watching us and judging us, why be good? Spinoza's answer to this question is perhaps the most beautiful of all his philosophy, and it begins, curiously, surprisingly, like everything in Spinoza, with a reinterpretation of the Garden of Eden. There is a scene in the second chapter of Genesis that is, in its own way, one of the most disturbing in all religious literature. And disturbing not in the sense of horror, but in the sense that the more you look at it, the more it fails to mean what it seems to mean. The scene is this: God created Adam. Then he created the Garden of Eden. He planted in the center of the garden 2 trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He told the man that he could eat from all the trees in the garden, except for the second one. On the day you eat from it, you will surely die. The serpent convinces Eve, and then Eve convinces Adam. They eat the forbidden fruit. They open their eyes, and the first thing they realize after acquiring the knowledge of good and evil is that they are naked, and they feel shame. God comes to the garden, walking in the cool of the evening. He calls for Adam. "Where are you?" Adam hides, he confesses. God observes, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." And then he expels them from the garden, before they can also eat from the tree of life and become immortal. For the Christian tradition, this scene is the account of the fall, the entrance of sin into the world, the moment when humanity lost original innocence and was condemned to labor, pain, and death. The serpent's guilt, Eve's weakness, Adam's complicity, all the theology of redemption, the meaning of Christ's incarnation, the necessity of baptism, all of this is anchored in this interpretation. For the Jewish tradition, the interpretation is different, but equally centered on disobedience as crime and exile as punishment. Spinoza read the same scene and saw something completely different. What he saw begins with a question that seems obvious, but that rarely anyone asks. Why did God prohibit knowledge? Think about it for a moment. You are an infinite, omniscient, omnipotent being, creator of the universe. You make a creature, a human being who is the pinnacle of your creation, and place it in a paradisiacal garden. And then you plant, in the center of that garden, a tree whose fruit gives knowledge, and you prohibit the creature from eating that fruit. Why? The traditional answers are varied. God wanted to test man's obedience. God knew that man was not ready for knowledge. God wanted man to reach knowledge the right way, not through the shortcut of temptation. The knowledge of good and evil is dangerous in the hands of an immature creature. Spinoza looked at these answers and asked another question. What if the narrative is not about obedience and disobedience? What if it is about something else? What if what Genesis calls the knowledge of good and evil is not moral knowledge, not knowing what is right and wrong, but rather the capacity for judgment, the ability to evaluate, to categorize, to say, this is good for me, this is bad for me. In other words, what Genesis is describing would not be the birth of moral consciousness, but the birth of the ego, of individual perspective, of subjectivity, of the separation between the self and the world. Before eating the fruit, Adam and Eve are in the garden without shame, without judgment, without separation between themselves and the nature around them. They are part of the garden as much as the trees and the animals. There is no subject looking at an object. There is simply integrated existence. After eating the fruit, the subject is born. Adam and Eve see themselves from the outside. They realize they are naked, which means they realize they exist as separate bodies, as distinct entities, as individual selves in a world that is beyond them. And they feel shame, the founding emotion of separation, the feeling of being seen from the outside, of having an exterior that can be judged. The expulsion from the garden in this reading is not punishment. It is an inevitable consequence. Once consciousness is born, once the human being discovers itself as a subject separate from the rest of the cosmos, the paradise of integration is permanently lost. Not because God is angry, but because paradise, by definition, was the state of non-separation, and consciousness is separation. This interpretation transformed Genesis from a story of crime and punishment into a story of growth and loss. A story that every person who has ever grown up recognizes in themselves. Childhood is Eden, a state in which you have not yet fully differentiated from the surrounding world, in which there is no shame, in which the body is not a separate object but simply the means by which you exist. Adolescence is the fall, the awakening of the individualized self, of self-awareness, of judgment, of shame. Maturity is the work outside the garden, conscious living, built ethics, the pursuit of knowledge. Spinoza did not write exactly in these terms. This language is mine from the 21st century, translating his ideas into contemporary vocabulary. What he wrote was more technical, more geometric. He had the habit of writing philosophy in the style of mathematical proofs, with axioms and propositions and corollaries, which made his work difficult to read but impossible to ignore. But the central intuition was this: Genesis, read with philosophical eyes instead of theological ones, tells the story of the emergence of human consciousness. It is not cosmology, it is anthropology. It is the answer in the form of a poetic narrative to the question, what does it mean to be human? And the answer that Genesis gives, the answer that Spinoza distilled and deepened, is that to be human is to be a being that knows, that judges, that separates, that in separating loses the paradise of integration, that spends the rest of life trying, in various ways, through philosophy, through art, through love, through science, through religion, to recover some form of that lost wholeness. This reading does not diminish Genesis. It elevates it. It transforms it from a naive cosmological account into one of the most psychologically profound texts humanity has produced. And in doing so, Spinoza was not destroying religion. He was finding its eternal core, that which no scientific discovery could invalidate, because it was not about facts of the external world, but about the inner experience that is universal to every thinking being. But there was a problem, a practical, political, human problem. To say this in public, to publish this thought, to let it reach the hands of any reader, educated or uneducated, believer or skeptic, required more than intellectual courage. It required something close to recklessness. And that is exactly what Spinoza demonstrated next. In 1670, a book was published in Amsterdam that had no author's name. On the title page, there was only a false publisher's name and an invented city of publication. Hamburg, it said, when in fact it had been printed in the Netherlands. The title was in Latin, Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, Theological Political Treatise. The strategy of anonymity and false address was reasonable and useless at the same time. Reasonable because the book was, by any standard of the time, intellectual dynamite. Useless because within months the entire cultured world of Europe knew exactly who had written that text. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus is the founding document of modern biblical criticism. It is the first text in Western history to treat the Bible systematically as a human historical document, subject to the same methods of analysis as any other ancient text. It is the book that, more than any other before Darwin, permanently separated faith from science, theology from philosophy, religious obedience from free thought. And at the heart of this text is an analysis of Genesis so radical that even today, 350 years after its publication, it disturbs. Spinoza's central argument begins with a philological analysis, a detailed study of the Hebrew language of the Genesis text. Spinoza was extraordinarily competent in Hebrew, and what his competence revealed was that the original text was much more ambiguous, much more plural, much more historically stratified than the translations into Greek, into Latin, into Luther's German, into King James English suggested. The translations tended to homogenize, to smooth over contradictions, to choose, when there was ambiguity, the theologically most convenient interpretation. Spinoza chose the linguistically most rigorous interpretation, even when it was theologically inconvenient, especially when it was. Take, for example, the question of the authorship of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, from Genesis to Deuteronomy, which tradition attributed to Moses. Spinoza examines the text closely and notes something extraordinary. Deuteronomy, supposedly written by Moses, describes Moses' death and what happened afterward. How could Moses have written the story of his own death? The obvious answer, that Moses prophesied his own death in advance as part of a divine revelation, was, for Spinoza, theologically convenient but textually indefensible. The style of the passage that describes Moses' death is identical to that of the rest of the historical narrative that precedes it. There is no change of voice, no marker indicating a transition to prophecy. It is simply the continuation of a historical narrative that someone, clearly later than Moses, wrote about him. Furthermore, the text of Genesis uses at various points the formula until today to describe situations that, if the text had been written by Moses in the 13th century BC, would not make sense. And that place is called that until today implies that the narrator is writing long after the events described, looking back, not forward. Spinoza also notes the existence of duplicates and variations. The same story told in slightly different ways in distinct passages, with different names for the same characters, with details that contradict each other. This is not possible if a single author of absolute genius, guided by divine inspiration, wrote the text in a continuous moment of revelation. It is possible, in fact it is inevitable, if the text is the result of a long process of composition and editing, with multiple authors and editors working over centuries. The conclusion that Spinoza draws, and that he published with all clarity, without euphemisms, without theological protections, is that the books that make up the Pentateuch were not written by Moses. They were written by human authors at different times and compiled by an editor, whom Spinoza identifies, following a tradition of rabbinic speculation, possibly with Ezra, the scribe who lived centuries after Moses, during the period of the return from the Babylonian exile in the 5th century BC. This did not make the text less significant for Spinoza, it made it more significant, because now, instead of being a document of incomprehensible supernatural origin, it was a document of comprehensible human origin. One could ask, who wrote this? When? In response to what historical challenges? With what political and moral objectives? What was the text trying to do to the people who read it when it was composed? Applying these questions to Genesis specifically, Spinoza arrived at a view of the text that was both more humble and richer than the religious tradition allowed. Genesis, in his analysis, is largely a document of the post-exilic period, that is, written or compiled after the Jews returned from exile in Babylon in the 5th and 6th centuries BC. This historical context is crucial. A people who have just returned from decades of exile, who had their land destroyed, their temple demolished, their national identity threatened. This people needs a narrative that reaffirms their identity, that answers fundamental questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? Why do we exist? What is our relationship with other peoples of the world? Genesis answers these questions. It answers in a way that, within the historical context in which it was compiled, was deeply functional, morally ambitious, and aesthetically majestic. The narrative of creation in 6 days answers the question, where did the cosmos come from, in a way that affirms the sovereignty of the God of Israel over all other gods of neighboring peoples. The God who creates with the word, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, is radically different from the Mesopotamian gods who create through cosmic battles and the fragmentation of primordial monsters. It is a God of order, of logos, of reason, a God who governs by the word. And it was precisely with this understanding that the narrative of Genesis is a historical, political, and philosophical intervention in the context of ancient Near Eastern cosmologies, not a trans-historical account of objective facts. That Spinoza opened the door to the entire tradition of biblical criticism that would follow. The publication of the Tractatus was received, predictably and immediately, as a scandal. The Reformed Ecclesiastical Council of Amsterdam asked the city government to ban the book. Other countries formally prohibited it. Religious polemicists published dozens of refutations. One described the book as the most pestilent the world has ever seen. Another claimed it had been forged in hell by an apostate Jew in collaboration with the devil. Spinoza read the refutations. He responded to some in private letters with a calm that is itself a form of argument. If the reasoning I present is wrong, show me where the error is. Don't tell me my ideas are diabolical. Tell me which premise I got wrong. No one could. And while the pamphlets burned and the polemicists shouted, Spinoza returned to the polishing bench, took the glass between his fingers, and continued his work. There is a problem in the text of Genesis that has disturbed theologians, philosophers, and scientists for millennia. It is a simple problem, almost embarrassingly simple, but it touches the heart of how we understand the relationship between sacred narrative and the physical reality of the universe. On the first day of creation, God says, "Let there be light," and there was light. On the fourth day, God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. Question: what was that light on the first day if the sun did not yet exist? This question, which young Benedict had asked his rabbi at 10 years old, receiving an answer about spiritual light, was for adult Spinoza much more than a theological curiosity. It was a window. A window that, if fully opened, revealed the entire architecture of thought that had constructed the narrative of Genesis. The solutions that the religious tradition has proposed over the centuries to this problem form a fascinating catalogue of what human thought does when it needs to reconcile a sacred text with observable reality. The most common solution in medieval Judaism was that of Or Haganuz, the hidden light. God created a primordial light in the early days, but upon realizing the future wickedness of humans, hid it, keeping it for the righteous in the world to come. The sun and the moon are merely crude substitutes for that original light. This solution is aesthetically powerful and theologically elegant, but as Spinoza noted, it is not in the text. It is a midrashic elaboration, a story about the story, invented to solve a problem that the original text, creation. The most common Christian solution was to assert that the light of the first day is divine light, the illuminating presence of God before material creation. Here, the solution works by connecting Genesis to the prologue of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was the light of men. The light of the first day is the Logos, the divine reason that precedes and sustains all material existence. This solution is also beautiful, and also, as Spinoza noted, it is not in the text of Genesis. It is a retroactive reading, an interpretation that reads Genesis through the lenses of a theology that would be developed millennia later. Spinoza's solution is different because it starts from a different principle. Instead of asking, how do we solve this problem to save the text, he asks, what does this problem tell us about how the text was written? And what it tells us is this: the text of Genesis was not written by someone concerned with the physical coherence of the cosmos. It was written by someone, by several someones, in fact over generations, concerned with the moral and theological coherence of the narrative. The distinction between the light of the first day and the sun of the fourth day is not a mistake. It is a deliberate theological statement. What this statement says is, light does not depend on the sun. The principle of illumination, of clarity, of order, of distinction between what exists and what does not exist, is prior to and independent of the physical sources of light. The sun is merely an instrument. The light itself is a more fundamental principle. Translated into Spinoza's vocabulary, reason, the capacity to order, distinguish, illuminate, is prior to and more fundamental than any physical object that manifests it. The mind does not depend on the brain to be what it is. The brain is merely the instrument through which the mind expresses itself in the material world. Logic does not depend on paper and ink to be true. Paper is merely the instrument through which logic becomes communicable. This distinction, which Spinoza saw as implicit in the light of the first day, connects directly to his central metaphysics, the distinction between the attributes of thought and extension, the two forms we know of the one infinite substance. Thought is not caused by extension, by matter, by the body, by the brain. Both are parallel and simultaneous expressions of the same fundamental reality. Like the light of the first day and the sun of the fourth day, not one causing the other, but both expressing, each in its own way, the same principle that preceded them. But there is another dimension in the light of the first day that Spinoza develops with a depth that is still astonishing today. The text says, "And God separated the light from the darkness." It did not say that God created the darkness. It said that he separated it from the light, suggesting that the darkness already existed, the primordial chaos, the tohu vabohu of the previous verse. Creation, in this reading, is not creation out of nothing. It is differentiation. It is the imposition of distinctions upon a reality that existed before as an undifferentiated mixture. This is, for Spinoza, a confirmation of something that geometry and philosophy had already demonstrated, that all creation is essentially distinction, that to create is to differentiate, that the mind that creates, whether divine or human, does not bring forth from nothing, but articulates, distinguishes, names, separates what was mixed. That is why, in the second chapter of Genesis, Adam's first act in the garden is to give names to the animals. Before Adam names them, the animals exist, but they are an undifferentiated mass of living beings. By naming, Adam creates. He does not create the matter of the animals. That was already there. He creates the distinction, the category, the concept, and it is through this creative activity of distinction and naming that Adam participates in divine creation, which for Spinoza is exactly what it means to be made in the image of God. Being made in the image of God does not mean having a form that resembles the form of a giant supernatural being sitting on a throne. It means having the capacity that God nature has, the capacity to differentiate, to order, to illuminate chaos with the light of reason. This reading transformed Genesis from a narrative about a cosmic king doing things over a period of 6 days into a meditation on the nature of intelligence, reason, and creativity. And it placed the human being not as a creature made of clay and dependent on divine mercy, but as an active participant in the creative process that sustains the cosmos. It was, simultaneously, one of the most philosophical readings and one of the closest to the original Hebrew text that had been produced up to that point. And it was, for that very reason, so threatening to religious authorities of all denominations. Because if the human being participates in creation through reason, then human reason has authority over sacred texts, not the other way around. The text cannot be used to silence reason, because reason is the very instrument by which the text must be understood. This was the philosophical bomb that Spinoza had hidden within a grammatical analysis of the Hebrew of the first chapter of Genesis, and it is still detonating. There is a recurring misconception, both among believers and skeptics, about what modern science has done with the story of Adam and Eve. Skeptics say, genetics has proven that there was no single couple from whom all humanity descends, therefore the myth of Adam and Eve is false. More literalist believers resist genetics, or reinterpret it in creative ways to preserve the literalness of the text. And both are, in their own way, answering the wrong question. Spinoza, 3 centuries before genetics, had already formulated the right question. The right question is not, did Adam and Eve exist historically? The right question is, what is the text of Genesis doing with the story of Adam and Eve? What is the work, philosophical, moral, psychological, that this narrative performs for those who receive it? And when you ask that question, you discover something surprising. The story of Adam and Eve perfectly withstands confrontation with modern science, not because science is wrong, but because the text was never doing what the literalist reading thinks it was doing. Spinoza begins his analysis of the Eden narrative by noting something that hurried readers generally overlook: the strangeness of the prohibition. Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. But why this specific prohibition? Why is the knowledge of good and evil the thing that God does not want the human being to have? The answer of the classical Christian tradition, original sin, disobedience, the fall, presupposes that Adam and Eve before the fall were morally full beings who made a bad choice. But Spinoza notes a contradiction. If Adam and Eve did not have knowledge of good and evil before eating the fruit, how could they make a moral choice? How could they disobey if they did not yet have the faculty to distinguish right from wrong? A 2-year-old child who touches the stove is not disobeying in the moral sense. They simply do not yet have the capacity to understand the prohibition in moral terms. This contradiction, which had troubled medieval theologians without any finding a satisfactory answer, led Spinoza to a radical conclusion: the divine prohibition in Genesis is not a moral commandment. It is a description of state. You shall not eat does not mean you must abstain to obey my law. It means, as long as you are what you are, you will not be able to eat this. In modern terms, it is like telling a baby that they cannot solve differential equations. It is not an order, it is a statement. A being without language and self-awareness cannot access the knowledge of good and evil. Not because it is forbidden, but because the conditions for that knowledge do not yet exist within them. The fall, then, is growth. The expulsion from the garden is maturation. The serpent, which tradition has demonized as an instrument of evil, is, in Spinoza's reading, the principle of curiosity, of questioning, of refusing to accept existence without interrogating it. And the question that the serpent poses, is it true that God said you cannot eat from any tree, is humanity's first philosophical question. The question that examines questions does not accept what is said without verification. Eve responds accurately, it is not from any tree that we cannot eat, but from a specific one. And then the serpent asks the second philosophical question, but why? Surely you will not die. God knows that on the day you eat, your eyes will be opened. This is the promise that tradition interpreted as a lie, but Spinoza notes that the serpent does not lie. The eyes of Adam and Eve are opened. They become like God, knowing good and evil. And this is confirmed by the text itself when God says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us." The serpent told the truth. And Adam and Eve do not die on the day they eat the fruit, at least not in the literal physical sense that the threat seemed to imply. They do die, yes, in one way. They die to childhood. They die to the state of innocent integration with the cosmos. They are born into adult consciousness, with all its gifts, judgment, sophisticated language, creativity, conscious love, and all its burdens, shame, separation, labor, conscious death. For Spinoza, this is one of the deepest narratives that humanity has produced about the nature of consciousness and the price we pay for it. And it is universal. It is not a story about the historical ancestors of a specific people, but a story about what happens to every human being that is born. The gradual loss of childhood integration with the world, the painful birth of the individualized self, the expulsion into the world of separation and responsibility. But Spinoza's analysis goes beyond individual psychology. It reaches the political dimension. In the text of Genesis, after the expulsion from the garden, God imposes different consequences for the serpent, for Eve, and for Adam. For the serpent, it will crawl on the ground in enmity with humans. For Eve, pain in childbirth and submission to her husband. For Adam, hard work, sweat, the resistant earth that only produces with effort. The theological tradition interpreted these consequences as punishments, sufferings that were introduced into the world as a result of sin. The physical nature of human childbirth, the hierarchy between man and woman, the difficulty of agricultural work, all were, in this reading, anomalies introduced into the natural order by a unique historical event, disobedience in the garden. Spinoza rejects this reading. For him, the consequences described in Genesis are not supernatural punishments. They are descriptions of the human condition as it is. Childbirth is painful for completely explainable evolutionary reasons. Agricultural work is difficult because the earth is not naturally adapted to human needs. The asymmetry of power between men and women in ancient societies was a social and political reality that the text written in those societies reflected and at the same time questioned. The questioning is in the narrative itself. The woman in the Genesis story is more active, more curious, more intellectually engaged than the man. It is Eve who dialogues with the serpent. It is Eve who examines the fruit and sees that it was good for food, pleasant to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. It is Eve who gives the fruit to Adam, not out of weakness, but out of intellectual generosity. Adam, in the text, simply eats, without comment, without resistance, without engagement with the issue. And then, when confronted by God, Adam does the most human thing possible. He blames the woman. The woman whom you gave me of the fruit, and I ate. For Spinoza, this detail is of immense psychological richness. The same consciousness that allows human beings moral knowledge also allows for denial, disresponsibility, the projection of blame onto others. Consciousness is not just illumination. It is also the possibility of all forms of self-delusion. Genesis, read this way, is a text that thinks with extraordinary depth about what it means to be human, not because it describes historical facts, but because it describes structural truths. Truths about the nature of consciousness, judgment, responsibility, the relationship between the sexes, the relationship between human beings and the cosmos. And this depth, Spinoza insisted, does not need a supernatural origin to be real. A text produced by thinking human beings over generations, reflecting on the human condition with all the intensity they are capable of, this text can contain a wisdom that is not diminished by being human. Perhaps it is greater. There are stories that appear in cultures so distant from each other, in such different times, with so many variations, and at the same time with such a recognizable structure, that the question of their origin becomes inevitable. The story of the universal flood is one of those stories. In Genesis, Noah. In the Sumerian epic poem of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim. In Greek mythology, Deucalion. In Hindu tradition, Manu. In Mesopotamian mythology of Babylon, Atrahasis. In dozens of other cultures around the planet, from Central America to China, from Greece to India, there are variations of the same theme. A god or gods decree the destruction of humanity by water. A righteous man is chosen to survive. A vessel is built. Animals are preserved. The waters recede. The survivor offers a sacrifice. The covenant with the deity is renewed. The Jewish and Christian religious tradition naturally viewed the story of Noah as historical, a unique, literal event that occurred at some point in the distant past, when the entire earth was covered by water and all humanity except Noah and his family was destroyed. There were, and still are, in certain circles, attempts to locate the remains of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat, to calculate the date of the flood based on biblical genealogies, to explain geologically how the waters could have covered the entire earth. Spinoza was contemporary with the first paleontological discoveries that would raise questions about the temporal scale of the earth, although the scientific debate on these issues would only become explicit in the following century. What he had in hand was philological and literary evidence. The similarity between the flood narrative in Genesis and the flood narratives of other cultures of the ancient Near East. And what this similarity indicated was something that the religious tradition had difficulty accepting. That the flood narrative in Genesis was not a unique revelation made to the people of Israel about a singular historical event. It was the Israelite version of a much older and much more widely distributed story. A story that existed in Mesopotamian culture centuries before the texts that today make up the Bible were compiled. For Spinoza, this was not an embarrassment, a weakness of the sacred text. It was, on the contrary, evidence of something profound about how human beings process experience. Catastrophic floods are not rare in the geological history of Mesopotamia. The Black Sea, according to some modern theories, may have experienced a massive flood about 7,000 years ago, when the rising Mediterranean Sea broke through what is now the Bosporus Strait. Regional flood events, devastating for the agricultural communities living in the plains of the great rivers, were part of the human experience of the ancient Near East. What the story of Noah does with this experience is what every myth does with the experience that inspires it. It elevates it. It transforms a natural event into a moral metaphor. It transforms a climatic catastrophe into a narrative about the relationship between humanity and the sacred. And here, Spinoza identifies the central philosophical gesture of the flood narrative in Genesis, which distinguishes it from its Mesopotamian counterparts in a way that is, in fact, genuinely original and profound. In the poem of Gilgamesh, the gods send the flood in a nearly capricious manner. Annoyed by the noise that humans make, they decide to exterminate them without great moral reason. One god, Ea Enki, warns Utnapishtim for reasons that have more to do with rivalries among deities than with any concern for justice. The flood, in the Mesopotamian version, is essentially arbitrary, an expression of the unpredictability of divine power. In Genesis, the flood has an explicit moral cause. The earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence. And Noah is preserved not by whim, not by being a personal favorite of a deity, but because he was a just man, perfect in his generations. The justification is moral, the logic is ethical. This detail, which seems small but is immense, is for Spinoza the proof that the text of Genesis, although it shares a narrative structure with the Mesopotamian versions, is doing something philosophically different with it. It is using the flood narrative to assert a principle that is the foundation of all ethics, that the cosmos is not morally arbitrary, that there is a connection between human conduct and the consequences that follow. That violence and corruption have real consequences, not as capricious supernatural punishment, but as a necessary result of a moral order that is woven into the structure of reality. This is, for Spinoza, the truth of Genesis, not the literal truth that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights until covering Mount Everest, but the moral truth that a world built on violence destroys itself, that communities that abandon justice fragment, that survival, individual and collective, depends on a fundamental ethical orientation. And there is more. The covenant that God establishes with Noah after the flood, symbolized by the rainbow, is, in Spinoza's analysis, an extraordinary political document. It is the first universal covenant in the Bible, not with a specific people, not with a particular nation, but with all humanity, with all flesh that is upon the earth. Jew, Gentile, white, black, rich, poor. The covenant of the rainbow is with everyone. Spinoza uses this detail to develop a point that is at the center of his political philosophy, the idea that there is a universal ethics, derivable from reason, that precedes and transcends the particular laws of any religion or nation. The law of Moses, which comes later in the biblical narrative, is a particular legislation for a specific people in a specific historical context. But the covenant of Noah is universal, and its substance, do not kill, do not steal, seek justice, is accessible to any human being who thinks regardless of their religious tradition. This idea, which Spinoza would extensively develop in his political philosophy, had revolutionary consequences for the issue of religious tolerance. If universal ethics does not require adherence to a specific religion, then no state has the right to persecute citizens for their religious beliefs, as long as their conduct is ethically irreproachable. Religious tolerance is not just political prudence, it is a philosophical requirement derived from the very nature of ethics. Spinoza wrote this in 1670, more than a century before the principles of religious tolerance were inscribed in the founding documents of the United States and the French Revolution. And he derived this tolerance, which is of extraordinary historical irony, from a philosophical reading of Genesis. The man who had been expelled from his religious community for interpreting the sacred text with excessive freedom was using that same text to ground the right of all human beings to freedom of thought. The story of the Tower of Babel is probably the briefest yet densest narrative in the book of Genesis. In just 9 verses, the text tells a story that touches on something so fundamental to the human experience that it has generated centuries of debate, doubt, and fascination. Humanity, in a distant past, had a single language and a single vocabulary. By consensus, humans decided to build a city with a tower that would reach the heavens, so that we would not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. God descends sees the tower and declares, "Behold, the people are one, and they all have one language, and now nothing will be impossible for them to do." Then God confuses the language of the builders, making them unable to understand each other, and scatters them across the world. The traditional interpretation, that this narrative is the etiological account of the origin of human linguistic diversity, a result of divine punishment for the arrogance of wanting to reach God, is one of the most universally known, and also, according to Spinoza, one of the most limited, because the text of Babel is, for Spinoza, one of the most sophisticated political commentaries produced by the ancient Israelite tradition. And to understand it as such, 3 observations must be made that a hasty reading generally overlooks. First observation: the humanity that was building the tower was not doing anything morally wrong. The text does not say they were being violent, unjust, or cruel. They were building, cooperating, using their intelligence and linguistic capacity for a collective project. This is good, not bad. Second observation: the explicit reason why God intervenes is not the arrogance of the builders in wanting to reach the heavens. That is the traditional interpretation, not the text. The explicit reason is, now nothing will be impossible for them to do. Linguistic uniformity is seen as an unlimited power that, implicitly, is dangerous. But dangerous for whom? Third observation: the result of the confusion of languages is the scattering of human beings across the earth, which was, ironically, exactly what the builders wanted to avoid. So that we would not be scattered, they said at the beginning. They were scattered, said the text at the end. For Spinoza, these 3 observations build a philosophical argument about the nature of centralized power that is, by the standards of the 17th century, extraordinarily modern. The Tower of Babel is not a story about the punishment of human arrogance. It is a story about the dangers of uniformity, about what happens when a single power, a single language, a single worldview becomes capable of organizing all human action without resistance. Uniformity is not just a state, it is a threat, not primarily to the gods, but to other human beings. Spinoza had read enough of history and knew enough of the politics of his time to understand that total unification projects of language, of religion, of power invariably culminate in forms of oppression. The Holy Roman Empire, which tried to unify the European continent under a single religious and political authority. The Spanish Inquisition, which sought to create religious uniformity by force. The Dutch Reformed Church, which in its own time was trying to limit the pluralism that made Amsterdam special. In all these attempts at uniformity, Spinoza saw the same impulse that the text of Babel described, the temptation to build a tower that eliminates dispersion, that forces everyone to speak the same language, that prevents the confusion of diversity. And in all these cases, diversity, the confusion of languages, ended up prevailing. Not because God intervened to confuse, but because human nature is essentially plural. Because the richness of human experience cannot fit into a single language, a single way of thinking, a single worldview. The Tower of Babel, in this reading, is not the punishment of humanity. It is humanity's liberation from the worst of its instincts, the instinct for security through uniformity, for protection through homogeneity, for power through the elimination of difference. But Spinoza goes further. He connects the narrative of Babel to one of his central ideas about the nature of language and knowledge. Language, for Spinoza, is not a transparent mirror of reality. It is a social, historical, contingent construction. The words we use shape and limit what we can think. A single language for all humanity would not be an approximation to the truth. It would be the imposition of a single cognitive structure over all the diversity of human experience. The multiplicity of languages, which Babel presents as punishment, is, in Spinoza's reading, a philosophical richness. Each language captures aspects of reality that other languages express poorly or do not express at all. Biblical Hebrew, with its verbal structure that prioritizes aspect over time, the quality of the action over when it occurs, captures something about temporal experience that Greek, with its richness of verb tenses, captures differently. Arabic, with its elaborately philosophical vocabulary, allows conceptual distinctions that medieval Latin needed long paraphrases to express. The confusion of Babel is the fecund confusion of diversity. It is the primordial chaos of Genesis chapter 1, the tohu vabohu, reappearing at the level of culture and language. And just as God orders primordial chaos without destroying it, simply differentiating, separating, illuminating philosophy orders linguistic diversity without uniformizing it, finding the rational principles that are common to all human experience, regardless of the language in which they are expressed. This is Spinoza's ambition, not the Tower of Babel, which seeks to reach God through forced uniformity, but philosophy as the language of the primordial light of the first day, an illumination that does not eliminate shadows, but makes them readable. And there is another level, even more intimate, in the reading of Babel that Spinoza makes. Spinoza wrote in Latin, the universal language of European intellectuals of his time, but thought in Hebrew and Portuguese. Latin was the language in which his ideas could circulate beyond the borders of a community or nation, but the texture of his thought, the rhythm of his intuitions, the flavor of his metaphors, these things had the scent of the Portuguese that his family spoke at home, the sound of the Hebrew he had learned in school, the precision of the Latin he had cultivated alone. He was, himself, a man of Babel, multiple, plural, situated at the intersection of traditions that could not be completely translated into one another. And this position of displacement, of not fully belonging to any language or tradition, of inhabiting the borders, was, he believed, the position of philosophy. Philosophy begins when you do not accept that the word you inherited is the only possible word for the thing, when you ask, what else could this thing be called? And by doing so, you begin to see the thing itself, not just the name. It was exactly what he had done with Genesis, with God, natural processes rather than divine intervention. Just as Spinoza argued that the universe operates according to necessary laws rather than arbitrary divine will, Darwin demonstrated that the variety of life arises from natural selection and evolution. This shift in understanding not only transformed biology, but also challenged the very foundations of religious thought, echoing Spinoza's earlier critiques of traditional interpretations of Scripture. The implications of Spinoza's ideas extended beyond theology and science. They also influenced philosophy, politics, and ethics. His vision of a rational universe governed by laws rather than capricious deities laid the groundwork for Enlightenment thinkers who sought to apply reason to all areas of human life. The notion that human beings could understand and shape their own destinies, free from the constraints of dogma, became a rallying cry for those advocating for democracy, individual rights, and social progress. Spinoza's emphasis on the interconnectedness of all things also resonated with later philosophical movements, such as pantheism and existentialism. His assertion that God and nature are one and the same challenged the dualistic thinking that had dominated Western thought for centuries. By proposing that everything is part of a single, unified reality, Spinoza invited people to reconsider their relationship with the world and with each other. In the realm of ethics, Spinoza's ideas about the nature of good and evil prompted a re-evaluation of moral philosophy. He argued that moral values are not absolute, but rather arise from the natural order of the universe. This perspective encouraged a more compassionate understanding of human behavior, recognizing that individuals act according to their circumstances and desires rather than adhering to rigid moral codes. Such insights paved the way for modern ethical theories that prioritize empathy and understanding over dogmatic adherence to rules. Despite the challenges he faced during his lifetime, Spinoza's legacy has endured and flourished. His works continue to inspire scholars, philosophers, and thinkers across disciplines, inviting them to engage with the profound questions of existence, knowledge, and morality. The very act of questioning established beliefs and seeking deeper truths, which Spinoza exemplified, remains a cornerstone of intellectual inquiry today. In conclusion, Spinoza's contributions to philosophy, theology, and science represent a pivotal moment in the evolution of human thought. His willingness to challenge convention and explore the depths of existence has left an indelible mark on the intellectual landscape. As we grapple with the complexities of our own time, Spinoza's insights serve as a reminder of the power of reason, the importance of questioning, and the beauty of a world that is both intricate and interconnected. His life and work exemplify the enduring quest for understanding and the relentless pursuit of truth that defines the human experience. Immediately recognized as one of the most profound thinkers of his time, he did not complete this monumental project. It remains unanswered. The history of philosophy and theology is replete with unfinished works, but the incompleteness of Spinoza's commentary on Genesis is particularly distressing, as he had the capacity to transform the understanding of the text and, by extension, the very nature of spirituality and ethics. What could have been a radical reinterpretation of the biblical narrative, which could have challenged traditional notions of authority and revelation, remained only a glimpse of what could have been. The absence of this completed work is a reminder of the fragility of ideas and the importance of giving voice to thoughts that may be considered controversial or unacceptable in their time. Spinoza's life was marked by his relentless pursuit of truth and understanding, and his refusal to conform to established norms led him to be a solitary figure, often misunderstood and even rejected by his contemporaries. However, his influence endures, and his ideas continue to resonate with those seeking a deeper understanding of the human condition and the universe. His vision of a God who is not a personal being, but rather the very order and harmony of the cosmos, offers a perspective that challenges traditional conceptions of divinity and morality. This vision not only transforms how we understand spirituality, but also invites us to reconsider our place in the world and the nature of our interactions with one another. Spinoza's philosophy, with its emphasis on reason and understanding, suggests that true freedom does not come from blind obedience to dogma, but from the ability to question, explore, and integrate knowledge into our lives. Spinoza's legacy is, therefore, a call to reflection and the pursuit of a more conscious and ethical life, where knowledge and understanding are valued above conformity and passive acceptance. In a world that often seems to be at odds, Spinoza's message about the underlying unity of reality and the importance of mutual understanding is more relevant than ever. He reminds us that, despite the divisions that may separate us, there is a common truth that unites us, and that the search for this truth is a journey worth undertaking. The incompleteness of his commentary on Genesis, while frustrating, also serves as an invitation for others to continue his work, exploring the depths of the text and its implications for contemporary life. Spinoza's philosophy is not merely a reflection on the past, but a source of inspiration for the future, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge and truth is a continuous journey that should never be abandoned. Meticulous, who had plans, who had the fragments, never completed it, is in itself a philosophical question. The most obvious answer is premature death. 44 years is too young for a genius who had spent the first 20 years of his intellectual life accumulating materials and forming ideas that needed decades to be fully articulated. He died before he had the time. But there is another, more unsettling answer. Perhaps Spinoza knew that a complete and systematic commentary on Genesis would be, by far, the most explosive of all his texts. The Tractatus had already generated a storm. The Ethics, published posthumously, generated another. A line-by-line commentary on the most sacred text of Western civilization, applying uncompromisingly the method that Spinoza had developed. Perhaps he thought it was a bomb that the world was not yet ready to detonate, and perhaps he was right, because even today, in the 21st century, with all modern biblical criticism, with all the advances of biblical archaeology, with all the theological openness that contemporary thought has produced, a commentary on Genesis that fully applies the Spinozist methodology without any theological concession would still be, in many contexts, deeply disturbing. What Spinoza left us, then, in the fragments and in the work he completed, is something more valuable than a finished commentary. It is a method, a way of looking, a disposition to read the text with one's own eyes, with one's own reason, with one's own honesty, and to trust what one sees, even when it is different from what authority says it should be seen. It is this method that has been passed down from Spinoza to Kant, from Kant to Hegel, from Hegel to Marx, from Marx to Freud, from Freud to the entire modern hermeneutic tradition. A tradition that, in its various branches, continues to ask the same question that Bento de Spinoza asked at 10 years old, to the rabbi who smiled at a question too good. If God created light before creating the sun, what was that light? The answer that Spinoza spent a lifetime elaborating is that that light is reason, the logos, the human capacity to distinguish, order, illuminate, and that this light does not depend on any external physical source to be what it is. It is in every being that thinks, in every moment when the mind encounters the cosmos and tries to understand it. That light was what Spinoza brought to the world, and it is still lit. There is a scene that has haunted me since the first time I read about Spinoza's death. It is Sunday, February 21st, 1677. Amsterdam is cold. Spinoza lives in The Hague, in a rented room in the house of Hendrik van der Spijk, a stained glass painter, and his wife. It is a simple family, religious in their own way, who had treated the philosopher with genuine kindness during the years he had spent with them. On the morning of that Sunday, Spinoza went down for breakfast with the family. He talked. He was pale. Tuberculosis had advanced in the last months, but lucid, calm, present. The van der Spijks went to Mass. They left Spinoza alone at home. When they returned, he had died, sitting in the chair by the window, with a view of the canal that ran through the neighborhood, and beyond to the winter sky of Holland. What was he thinking in those final moments? We have no way of knowing. But we have the philosophy he left, and it tells us something. Spinoza had written in the Ethics the most disturbing yet simultaneously comforting proposition of all Western philosophy. We feel and experience that we are eternal. Not we believe, not we hope. We feel and experience, present indicative, something that is accessible now, not just after death. What he understood by this is the heart of everything he developed about Genesis, about God, about the nature of creation. Eternity for Spinoza is not infinite duration in time. It is not a future that begins after death and continues forever. That would just be an immense quantity of time, and time for Spinoza is a category of the finite mode of existence, not a property of the infinite substance. God nature does not exist in time. It exists in a way that transcends time, just as a mathematical theorem does not exist in time. 2 + 2 = 4 did not start being true at some point, and will eventually stop being true. It is true in a way that is completely outside the temporal flow. The eternity that we feel and experience is this. When the human mind understands something with perfect clarity, when it sees a necessity, a connection, a truth, it is participating, at that moment, in the eternal mode of existence. It is not just thinking a thought that happens in time, it is touching something that is not in time. Spinoza exemplified this with mathematical truths. When you understand why the Pythagorean theorem is true, when you not only accept the result but comprehend the internal necessity of the demonstration, you are touching eternity. Because the relationship between the squares of the legs and the square of the hypotenuse is not true since yesterday and will cease to be true tomorrow. It is true in a way that is outside of time, and the deepest philosophical understanding, what Spinoza called scientia intuitiva, the intuitive knowledge that goes beyond rational knowledge to reach a direct vision of the necessity of things, is for him the closest experience we have of participating in the perspective of the eternal. What does this have to do with Genesis? Everything. Because what Genesis describes in its first chapter is precisely a mind, or the mind that coincides with reality. What tradition calls God, that sees everything from a perspective in which time is not the main mode of organization. The God who says, "Let there be light," is not waiting for the result. The light is already in command, already in the necessity of the command. The God who separates light from darkness is not doing something that he could choose not to do. He is expressing what necessarily is. And when this God sees that it is good, the formula repeated every day of creation, he is not making an aesthetic evaluation after the fact. He is expressing the perfect coincidence between intention and result, between necessity and being, between what must be and what is. This is what Spinoza saw when he looked at the first chapter of Genesis with his way of looking, a meditation on the identity between the mind that understands and the reality that is understood, an affirmation that the cosmos is not something external to the mind that thinks it, that the distinction between thought and extension, between mind and matter, is a distinction of perspective within a more fundamental unity. And this is what, contrary to what his adversaries always claimed, made Spinoza's philosophy not atheistic, but deeply religious. Not religious in the sense of obedience to an external authority. Religious in the original sense of the word, which derives from the Latin religare, to reconnect, the experience of being reconnected to the whole, the temporary dissolution of the separation that individual consciousness creates. We return to the Garden of Eden. The fall, the birth of individual consciousness, the expulsion from the garden of innocent integration, was, for Spinoza, necessary, inevitable, the path to the intellectual and moral development that makes humans what they are. Without the fall, there would be no reason. Without reason, there would be no philosophy. Without philosophy, there would be no possibility of touching back that unity that was lost, this time not as innocence, but as understanding. The return to Eden that religion promises in the future, Spinoza proposed in the present, in the experience of philosophical understanding, of clear vision, of the moment when the mind touches the necessity of things, and by touching it, touches something that is not in time. We feel and experience that we are eternal. We sit with the family, we have breakfast, we say goodbye, we are left alone by the window. We look at the canal, at the grey winter sky, at the leafless trees by the water's edge, and we die, like everyone dies. But thought did not die. The method did not die. The question, what was that light before the sun, did not die. And the answer that Spinoza spent a lifetime building, the answer that says, that light is reason, it is necessity, it is what is most fundamental in everything that exists, and you participate in it every time you think clearly, every time you see a truth with your own eyes, without asking for permission. That answer also did not die. It is here, now. The moment you finish reading this story, the Genesis that Spinoza gave us is not an origin. It is a mirror that the 17th century polished, with hands that also polished glass, and left for all the centuries that came after. And what this mirror shows is not the distant past of a cosmos that emerged in 6 days. It is you, now, thinking, separating light from darkness, naming the animals, asking questions you shouldn't be asking. It is you in the garden, with the fruit in hand. And the question that remains? The question that Spinoza left us, and that no dogmatic answer can completely resolve, neither that of religious tradition nor that of simplistic rationalism, is this: will you eat? The light is waiting, since the first day, before the sun, always.